I'm Christopher Davis. I'm the Minter Martin Professor of Engineering and Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Maryland College Park. I've been on the faculty for 44 years and I've done research over all that time in areas of wireless communications. And one of the particular points I want to make today is that the FCC sets standards for human exposure, but that are based on the work of other bodies that have looked very carefully at any risk associated with radio frequency emissions. And I assure you that everything I know about 5G installations is that they will be completely safe, that the powers that they emit are tiny compared to the FCC standards. And my judgment is that the placement of towers, the height of the towers, the powers that are used, this is all part of how you make a wireless communication network work. You can't impose arbitrarily to say, well, you must put a pole here or you mustn't put a pole there. I would urge you to listen to the experts who are installing the network. And I'm sure they're very rational about compromise, but you have to have a certain density of poles and powers in order for the network to function efficiently. And I think that's very important to take note of. And I really want to assure you that over many, many years of looking into whether there's any health risk from low power radio frequency emissions, I can assure you that all my own research has convinced me over many, many years that this is not a matter of concern. And I sometimes get a little irritated when I find the community complaining that their cell service is no good. And the reason it's no good is that they don't want to have another tower in their community. Well, you've got to be rational about it one way or the other. If you want to have wireless communications, you do have to have the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and representatives. Good afternoon. I'm Christopher Davis. I'm Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Maryland, and I've been involved with research on RF and its possible effects on humans for over 40 years. And I'd like to really begin this afternoon by trying to clear up some of the inaccuracies and inconsistencies that I heard in the testimony I was listening to this morning. And a lot of it pertains to what are the safety standards for exposure to radio frequency. Over many years, expert scientific bodies have studied all the literature and evaluated it in deciding what a safety standard should be. This was actually not done by the Federal Communications Commission. It was done by the IEEE and then in conjunction with ANSI and also National Council on Radiation Protection. And these were very large bodies of experienced scientists, physicists, engineers, biologists, MDs, who looked at all the literature. And these standard setting bodies continue to look at all the literature and evaluate it comprehensively to decide what is a safe level for public exposure. And the safety standards that they promulgated were adopted by the FCC. So when you talk about the FCC standard, yes, that's the legislative legal standard that the wireless communication industry has to subscribe to. But in reality, it's based on scientific evidence, scientific study. And we all know that there are tremendous varieties of studies out there. And the community that comes up with safety standards evaluates all these studies. So, for example, the head of the FDA, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, recently sent out a press release talking about the recent NTP study, which was mentioned this morning, and pointed out that this was well within the purview and consideration, and they have decided it doesn't require any modification of safety standards because the exposure levels used in the NTP study were very, very high compared to what one would experience, certainly from these small cell installations. Now, I don't know whether you've had time to read it, but you have in front of you my actual written testimony. And part of that written testimony is calculations I have made of what the maximum exposure a person might get who is in very close proximity to a small cell installation. And you might see, if you look at this chart, that even at the highest levels of 4 radios on a 30-foot tower with an effective radiated power of 120 watts, the maximum exposure that a human could get is still hundreds of times smaller than the safety standard that the FCC uses based on the scientific evaluation of these many expert committees. And indeed, expert committees worldwide, including Canada, New Zealand, the European Community, and so on, they've re-examined these safety standards and all concur that the current safety standard is a very great protector of human health, because the maximum exposure levels that these standards permit are still a factor of 50 times below the only effects that have ever been observed in animals. And these were behavioral effects. Even at those high levels, there's no real evidence that permanent harm occurred, but there's a 50 factor of safety in these safety standards. And I certainly, after my many years of experience working in this field, feel very confident that these safety standards are extremely protective of human health. And I think the technology that's based on what we've been talking about today has great value to society. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and representatives.
Mr. Dugan, you testify on behalf of the industry or not? Okay, you need to put your microphone on. You need to put your microphone on though.
Oh, sorry.
Because we want to nail down that conflict of interest.
Yeah, I have a
Stop it.
I have a business relationship with all the
Okay,
carriers,
I'm
and I
just
do work
checking.
for Verizon as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that on the record, but also, do you have any reaction to the woman next to you who testified to what she described as what might be dangerous?
I do, and I have a different viewpoint. I've spent my entire career, good part of 30 years, standing in front of base station antennas, particularly on rooftops, where Verizon and the other carriers certify safety with respect to the guidelines for occupational workers that must, perform maintenance work on rooftops. I don't agree with using the terms pollution and I don't even agree with using the term radiation. When I was growing up as a kid, driving my Volkswagen Beetle and listening to my AM/FM radio, I didn't think of the radio signals that deliver music to my car as radiation or pollution. These are low power.
Depending on what you were listening to.
Perhaps.
But
yeah.
also the strength of what was happening was quite a bit different, right?
Pardon me?
The strength of what was emitted was far less out of your radio in your car.
I don't agree with that, depending on where you're located. The wireless base stations of Verizon Wireless are transmitting very, very low power. Mm-hmm. They're not like broadcast facilities. They're on big towers serving a major city. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, the wireless communications transmit powers are so small compared to what broadcast facilities are transmitting.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Dugan, and I am a registered professional engineer in the state of Maryland in support of House Bill 654, encouraging the deployment of small wireless facilities to promote the next generation of wireless services. I am here to speak on the issue of small cell safety concerns and the benefits of 5G. I am an independent radio frequency consulting engineer with Millennium Engineering PC and have been performing safety certifications and field measurements of existing facilities for the past 25 years. As a registered professional engineer, my first priority is to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public and to issue all public statements in an objective and truthful manner. The Federal Communications Commission has sole jurisdiction over the regulation of electromagnetic fields for licensees, and the subject is preempted provided the facilities comply with the guidelines. The FCC guidelines for operating wireless networks are based on the recommendations of several national and international health and safety agencies, including but not limited to the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the American International Standards Institute, and National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. Verizon plans to deploy 2 classifications of low-power small cells in the state of Maryland. Class A small cells are a hybrid 4G and 5G solution, while Class B is a 5G only solution. Using FCC prescribed methodologies, the calculated upper limit exposure from a 4G small cell is on the order of less than 2% of the FCC's general population exposure limit. The calculated upper limit ground level exposure from a Class B small cell is 0.25% of the FCC's general population exposure limit. In layman's terms, the predicted upper limit exposure are approximately 50 to 500 times below what the FCC has adopted as safe levels of human exposure to electromagnetic fields. Keep in mind that the exposure limits already have a safety factor of 50 to 100 built into them. Low levels of RF emissions surround us daily, essentially everywhere, 24/7 from various sources in our environment. The contribution to relatively low power radio signals from small cells is not going to consequently elevate the existing composite RF exposure in the environment. 5G will radically improve the bandwidth capacity and reliability of mobile broadband, resulting in enhanced throughput speeds and lower latency, shorter response times. The deployment of small cells is essential to the rollout of 5G technology. 5G is a key component of advancing wireless technology and improving the smart cities model of the future, driving improvements in public safety, the environment, local economies, and communication. Eliminating some of the hurdles involved with 5G small cell deployment will help to accommodate meeting the exponentially growing consumer demand for wireless data. This technology is integral to attracting new investment, growing the economy, and allowing the state of Maryland to remain economically competitive both now and in the future. Thank you.
Delegate Howard. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just real quick, I'm looking at these exposure limits on 1.13, 1.130B. Walk me through that a little bit, because and we can do it offline too, but I'm looking at an average time in minutes is 6, and I'm wondering, maybe 30 max, depending on the frequency range. What is the average? Where does the average person fall? And this average time in minutes, is that, I don't know if cumulative is the right word, or is that, they've got all kinds of different, whether the person knows they're being exposed, whether they don't know they're being exposed. It's really confusing. It's really broken down. And I have heard this as a concern before. So, and maybe if you could just briefly in like 20 seconds go through that. I know that's not a lot of time, but we're talking about putting these things near homes, and you're saying that the exposure rates are very low, but I guess cumulatively, is that a negative effect, or do you understand what I'm trying to get at a little bit here?
Sure. Very briefly, you mentioned this.
I'm on the Legal Information Institute, and 1.1307 subsection B is what I'm looking at as far as Code of Federal Regulations 47, as far as the exposure limits. So just heads up.
Well, that sets the national standard for compliance with electromagnetic field safety. You mentioned there's two sets of exposure limits, one for occupational workers that are aware of the potential for exposure, and one much more restrictive for the general public that may not be aware of the potential for exposure.
Right.
The actual exposure from these types of facilities will be like hundreds of times below the exposure limits. But what that 6-minute and 30-minute what that means is, for occupational workers, the time average over a 6-minute interval cannot exceed the exposure limit. For the occupational or the general public, over a 30-minute time average cannot exceed the exposure limit. You can exceed it momentarily within that time window, but the average exposure cannot exceed the exposure limit.
How does that affect one of these things being in a neighborhood and close to a home? How does that?
It doesn't. It doesn't, because when you comply with the guidelines, those time windows don't even matter. Because you could have unlimited exposure to low levels of electromagnetic field and not be impacted.
Thank you.